In 2009, one of America's most iconic companies collapsed. General Motors, once the symbol of U.S. industrial power, went bankrupt overnight. How did a $100 billion car empire, the pride of Detroit, end up begging for government rescue? Today, we uncover the shocking truth behind GM's downfall. Chapter 1: The Collapse of the American Dream. An ominous prelude. The story of General Motors is not just the story of a company. It is the story of America itself, the rise of an empire, the intoxication of limitless growth, and the devastating collapse when ambition collides with reality. It is a cautionary tale wrapped in steel and chrome, built on the roaring engines of Detroit, and drowned by the silence of bankruptcy courts decades later. For most of the 20th century, GM was not merely a car company. It was the car company, the beating heart of American industry, a symbol of technological triumph, economic power, and cultural dominance. At its peak, General Motors was so massive, so entrenched in American life, that many believed it was invincible. Presidents, Wall Street executives, and ordinary citizens alike looked to GM as the embodiment of the American dream, a dream forged in assembly lines and highways where mobility was freedom and every family aspired to park a Chevrolet in the driveway. But dreams can rot from the inside. Empires collapse not because of sudden catastrophe, but because of cracks that grow, slowly, invisibly, until the weight of arrogance and mismanagement tears everything apart. General Motors was no exception. By the early 21st century, the company that once commanded the global automobile industry had become a bloated, debt-ridden giant, unable to adapt, unable to reform, unable to survive. In 2009, GM filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy, the largest industrial bankruptcy in American history. To understand how this happened, one must look far deeper than numbers on a balance sheet. GM's downfall was not merely financial, it was cultural, political, and psychological. It was about greed disguised as growth, short-term profits masquerading as strategy, and executives who ignored the storm until it swallowed them whole. The illusion of permanence. Throughout the 1950s and 1960s, GM seemed eternal. It controlled more than half of the U.S. car market, employed hundreds of thousands of workers, and shaped the identity of cities like Detroit, Flint, and Pontiac. The company became so powerful that its influence reached beyond business. Politicians consulted its leaders before making policy decisions. Media glorified its executives as industrial titans. Even international governments negotiated with GM as if it were a sovereign power. But hidden beneath this glory was a dangerous assumption, that dominance was permanent. GM executives believed the American consumer would never change, that competitors would always remain behind, and that sheer size guaranteed survival. This illusion of permanence blinded them to reality. While Japanese automakers quietly developed fuel-efficient, reliable cars, GM poured billions into oversized, gas-guzzling vehicles that symbolized status but not sustainability. This hubris would later prove fatal, but in the beginning, it was intoxicating. GM's success was so overwhelming that in 1953, Charles Wilson, then president of the company, famously declared, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country." For a time, that statement seemed true. GM's health mirrored America's prosperity. But by the dawn of the 21st century, the opposite would be true. GM's collapse mirrored America's own cracks: economic inequality, corporate greed, and political paralysis. Detroit, the empire's throne to understand. GM. One must understand Detroit. Once called the Motor City, Detroit was the Rome of America's industrial empire. Its skyline was shaped by smokestacks, its neighborhoods by factory whistles. Immigrants from Europe, workers from the South, and dreamers from across the nation poured into the city to join the automotive revolution. For every family that came, GM provided hope, a stable job, a pension, a future. For decades, Detroit thrived. Skyscrapers rose downtown, neighborhoods flourished, and middle-class life expanded. GM was the engine of this prosperity, pumping money, jobs, and confidence into the city. But prosperity bred complacency. As GM's profits soared, management grew distant from the workers, unions grew more militant, and the delicate balance of industry and community began to fray. Detroit's identity became tied so closely to GM that the city's fate would rise and fall with the company. When GM prospered, Detroit shined. When GM stumbled, Detroit bled. And when GM finally collapsed, Detroit's fate was sealed. The city spiraled into bankruptcy just a few years after the automaker. The fall of GM and the fall of Detroit were not parallel stories. They were the same story. Warning signs ignored. The seeds of GM's collapse were visible long before the final bankruptcy. By the 1970s, oil crises revealed the vulnerability of oversized American cars. Consumers began seeking smaller, more efficient vehicles, cars made by Toyota, Honda, and Nissan. GM executives, however, dismissed the threat. They clung to their old formula, assuming that American patriotism would keep consumers loyal, but patriotism does not pay for gas. Consumers began abandoning GM's bloated sedans and trucks for Japanese alternatives. Instead of innovating, GM doubled down, using flashy marketing to mask declining quality. Executives created a maze of overlapping brands: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, Saturn, Hummer, flooding the market with vehicles that looked different but shared the same underlying flaws. By the 1980s, GM was hemorrhaging market share. The warning lights were flashing, but the company's size allowed it to hide the truth. It was still massive, still profitable, but cracks widened beneath the surface. Quality control failed. Costs ballooned. Unions demanded higher wages and benefits, while management squandered billions on bad investments and vanity projects. What should have been a wake-up call became a lullaby. GM lulled itself to sleep while competitors sharpened their blades. The shadow of bankruptcy by the early 2000s, GM's problems could no longer be ignored. The company was drowning in legacy costs, pensions, healthcare obligations, and outdated labor contracts. For every car sold, thousands of dollars were already eaten by expenses unrelated to production. Competitors, unburdened by these obligations, could sell cars cheaper and with better quality. Debt mounted. Cash reserves evaporated. Still, executives refused to face reality. Instead, they continued producing oversized SUVs and trucks, hoping consumer demand would stay frozen in time. But reality does not bend to hope. When the 2008 global financial crisis struck, GM was already on its knees. The collapse of credit markets was the final blow. Sales plummeted, financing evaporated, and the company's survival became impossible. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for bankruptcy protection. The once immortal giant was reduced to a ward of the state, bailed out by billions of taxpayer dollars. A symbolic death, the bankruptcy of GM was not just a corporate failure. It was a symbolic death. The American dream, once defined by secure jobs, affordable homes, and family cars, now stood exposed as fragile, vulnerable, and unsustainable. GM's collapse revealed the truth. Unchecked corporate arrogance, blind faith in size, and a refusal to adapt will destroy even the mightiest of empires. This was not merely the story of a company that failed to sell cars. It was the story of how America lost faith in itself. Chapter 2. The Birth and Rise of General Motors. From Workshop to Empire. General Motors did not begin as a titan. It did not rise from the industrial landscape as a colossus ready to conquer the world. Instead, like most empires, it began humbly, through the vision of a few men, the hunger for opportunity, and the chaos of early American capitalism. The seeds of GM's empire were planted at the dawn of the 20th century, in an America intoxicated with invention and restless ambition. The United States at that time was a nation in motion. The horse was giving way to the automobile, and the automobile was no longer a novelty. It was the future. Factories sprouted across the Midwest, producing machines that redefined freedom, speed, and modern life. In dusty barns and noisy workshops, inventors fought for dominance. Dozens of automakers appeared, each dreaming of immortality, yet most would vanish within a decade. Out of this chaos came William C. Durant, a man who saw not just the automobile, but the industry it could become. Durant was not an engineer. He was not an inventor. He was something far more dangerous, a salesman. He possessed the vision and charisma to transform scattered workshops into a unified empire. Where others saw cars as mechanical marvels, Durant saw them as products to be marketed, brands to be expanded, and companies to be consolidated. Durant's genius was not in building cars, but in building corporations. And in 1908, he founded what would soon become the most powerful industrial machine in the world, General Motors. The early experiment, General Motors, was, from the start, an experiment in scale. While Henry Ford focused on perfecting a single product, the Model T, Durant pursued an empire of variety. His philosophy was simple. Why build one car when you could build many? Why sell to one type of customer when you could capture them all? Durant's strategy was radical. Instead of focusing on one brand, he began acquiring companies: Buick, Oldsmobile, Cadillac, and dozens of others. Each brand targeted a different segment of society: the working-class laborer, the aspiring middle-class family, the wealthy elite. By assembling this portfolio, Durant created not a company, but a universe. For the first time in automotive history, a corporation could serve every corner of the market under one roof. This idea, segmentation, would define GM for the next century. Durant envisioned General Motors as a pyramid, with Chevrolet at the base, Buick and Oldsmobile in the middle, and Cadillac at the top, symbolizing prestige. It was a system of aspiration. Consumers could climb the ladder of GM brands as their wealth and status grew. The car was not just transportation, it was identity. But Durant's brilliance came with chaos. His reckless expansion, financed by borrowed money and unrestrained ambition, brought GM to the edge of collapse more than once. By 1910, just 2 years after its founding, the company nearly imploded under the weight of debt. Durant was forced out. But empires have a way of surviving even without their creators, and GM's empire would soon find steadier hands: Alfred P. Sloan and the Age of Order. If Durant was the dreamer, Alfred P. Sloan was the architect. Joining GM in the 1920s, Sloan reshaped the chaotic empire into a disciplined powerhouse. He was cold, analytical, and methodical, the very opposite of Durant's flamboyant charisma. Sloan introduced structure where there had been none. He established a clear hierarchy of brands, ensuring that each carmaker had its place in the pyramid. Chevrolet became the affordable workhorse, competing directly with Ford's Model T. Buick offered a step up, Oldsmobile added sophistication, and Cadillac reigned supreme as a luxury symbol. This system gave GM the ability to capture every type of consumer while preventing internal cannibalization. But Sloan's most brilliant innovation was not mechanical. It was psychological. He introduced the idea of the annual model change. Unlike Ford, who focused on producing a cheap and durable car with little variation, GM tapped into the psychology of desire. Each year, GM released slightly updated models, new colors, new styles, new features. Consumers began trading in perfectly functional cars just to have the latest model. The automobile became fashion, and GM controlled the runway. This innovation transformed GM into a money machine. Profits soared as Americans eagerly embraced the cycle of consumption. The car was no longer just a necessity. It was a status symbol, a reflection of identity. By the 1930s, GM had overtaken Ford and established itself as the undisputed leader of the automotive world. The empire expands by mid-century. General Motors was more than a company. It was an empire that shaped the very fabric of America. During World War II, GM transformed its factories into war machines, producing tanks, planes, and weapons. Its industrial capacity helped secure Allied victory, and its reputation soared. When the war ended, GM returned to producing cars, now fueled by the economic boom of the 1950s. The post-war years became GM's golden era. Highways spread across the nation, suburbs exploded in growth, and the dream of homeownership was paired with the dream of car ownership. GM cars filled driveways from coast to coast. Chevrolet Bel Airs, Cadillac Eldorados, Buick Roadmasters. These machines were not just vehicles, they were cultural icons. GM's influence stretched far beyond Detroit. It dictated the pace of steel production, rubber harvesting, oil consumption, and glass manufacturing. Entire industries rose and fell on GM's decisions. It became the largest employer in America, with hundreds of thousands of workers. By the mid-1950s, it controlled more than 50% of the U.S. car market. No competitor came close. To work for GM meant stability. To buy GM meant status. To live in GM's world was to believe in the permanence of prosperity. The myth of invincibility. The 1960s, GM had become more than a corporation. It was a myth. Its dominance was so complete that even the U.S. government treaded carefully around it. The company's revenue rivaled the GDP of some nations. Its executives were treated like royalty, its decisions like decrees. This myth of invincibility fed arrogance. The corporate headquarters in Detroit became a temple of industrial power. Executives looked down upon competitors, dismissing innovation outside their own walls. They believed consumers would always remain loyal, that the American car would always dominate, and that GM's empire could never fall. But as history has always shown, myths are dangerous. They blind those who believe in them. They create an illusion of stability where instability lurks, and they convince empires that their decline is impossible until it arrives. The birth and rise of General Motors was nothing short of spectacular. It was the embodiment of the American dream, an industrial miracle, and a cultural powerhouse. Yet within this rise lay the seeds of collapse. Durant's reckless expansion, Sloan's obsession with style over substance, the illusion of permanence, and the arrogance of invincibility. All of these would later resurface as fatal flaws. For now, however, GM stood tall. It was the king of Detroit, the architect of America's highways, and the symbol of national pride. But shadows were already forming on the horizon. The empire was vast, but it was also heavy, and history has always been unkind to empires that forget their limits. Chapter 3. The Golden Age. GM at the peak of its power. There was a time when General Motors was not just a car company. It was the beating heart of the American economy, the crown jewel of Detroit, and the very embodiment of post-war prosperity. To live in the United States during the 1950s and 1960s was to live in a world shaped, directly or indirectly, by GM. At its peak, the company was so vast, so influential, that it became difficult to separate GM from America itself. The two were reflections of each other, confident, ambitious, seemingly unstoppable. If the early decades of GM were about survival and growth, the mid-20th century was about domination. GM had risen above Ford and Chrysler, cementing its place as the undisputed leader of the automotive industry. It controlled more than half the U.S. market, sold millions of cars each year, and set the pace for global manufacturing. Competitors watched helplessly as GM expanded into every corner of American life. The company was not just an industry leader, it was an empire in full bloom. The post-war boom, the Second World War, had reshaped the global economy, and in its aftermath, the United States emerged as the world's industrial superpower. Unlike Europe and Asia, which lay in ruins, America's factories were intact and primed for production. General Motors, which had spent the war years building tanks, aircraft engines, and armored vehicles, now turned its colossal machinery back toward civilian life. The timing could not have been more perfect. Returning soldiers craved stability, prosperity, and the comforts they had long been denied. Suburbs spread across the nation like wildfire, connected by the growing network of interstate highways. With new homes came the need for new cars. Cars for commuting, for family trips, for status. And GM was there to provide them all. The company flooded the market with vehicles that symbolized optimism, confidence, and progress. Shiny chrome, sweeping fins, bold grills, these were not just machines. They were expressions of American identity. A Chevrolet in the driveway meant middle-class success. A Cadillac in the garage meant you had arrived. Cars became woven into the fabric of everyday life. They were not simply tools of transportation. They were extensions of the self, symbols of freedom, tokens of aspiration. And GM, more than any other automaker, mastered this psychology. Design as power, what set GM apart in its golden age was not just its ability to manufacture cars, but its mastery of design. Under the leadership of men like Harley Earl, GM transformed the automobile into a work of art. Earl, the legendary head of GM's styling division, understood something profound. Cars were not bought with logic, but with emotion. Every curve, every chrome detail, every tail fin was crafted to inspire desire. GM vehicles of the 1950s and 1960s were rolling sculptures, each one a statement of modernity and style. Earl pioneered the concept of dream cars, futuristic prototypes shown at auto shows to captivate the public imagination. Even if the technology wasn't ready, the vision was clear. GM wasn't just selling cars, it was selling the future. The strategy worked. Customers flocked to dealerships not because they needed a car, but because they wanted one. The automobile became fashion, and GM dictated the trends. Competitors scrambled to imitate, but none could match the scale, resources, and creativity of General Motors. The corporate machine behind the glamour of chrome and fins was a corporate machine of staggering efficiency. GM employed hundreds of thousands of workers across dozens of factories. Its supply chain stretched across the globe, steel from Pittsburgh, rubber from Southeast Asia, oil from Texas. The company's decisions rippled across entire industries. Internally, GM was a model of organization. Alfred P. Sloan's system of brand hierarchy and annual updates had matured into a flawless strategy. Each division knew its role. Chevrolet provided affordability, Pontiac added flair, Oldsmobile offered prestige, Buick symbolized comfort, and Cadillac reigned as luxury incarnate. Customers could climb the ladder of brands as their income rose, never leaving the GM family. This structure created loyalty so deep that for many families buying GM was tradition. Fathers drove Chevrolets, sons aspired to Buicks, and grandfathers revered Cadillacs. Brand loyalty became generational, binding Americans to GM in ways few companies have ever achieved. Power beyond cars. By the 1950s, GM's reach extended far beyond automobiles. The company's sheer size made it a central force in American politics, economics, and culture. Its workforce was so vast that union negotiations with the United Auto Workers often set the tone for labor relations across the nation. A wage increase. at GM could ripple through the economy, raising living standards for millions. Executives wielded influence that bordered on political authority. Charles Wilson, the former GM president who became Secretary of Defense, famously declared, "What's good for General Motors is good for the country." For many years, this was not hyperbole. It was reality. GM's prosperity was tied directly to America's prosperity. The company also shaped landscapes. Suburbs grew because cars made commuting possible. Highways expanded because GM lobbied for them. Gas stations, motels, fast food chains, all were byproducts of a car culture that GM had helped create. In many ways, GM wasn't just responding to America's needs, it was creating them. The myth of perfection. At the height of its power, GM seemed untouchable. It controlled markets, dictated trends, influenced politics, and shaped culture. 2. Investors, it was a guaranteed source of profit. To workers, it was a source of security. To consumers, it was a source of pride. But, with great power comes great illusion. GM began to believe in its own myth of perfection. Quality issues were ignored because sales were strong. Innovation slowed because profits seemed endless. Competitors were dismissed as insignificant. The arrogance of success became the seed of future failure. Still, in the golden age, these cracks were invisible. The chrome shone too brightly, the profits too vast, the empire too grand. To the average American in the 1950s and 1960s, GM was not just a company, it was an institution, a way of life, a promise that prosperity was permanent. The peak, the numbers tell the story of GM's peak. By 1962, it controlled more than 50% of the U.S. car market, an unimaginable level of dominance in modern times. It employed over 600,000 people, directly and indirectly supporting millions of families. Its annual revenues rivaled the GDP of entire nations. Cadillac symbolized ultimate prestige. Chevrolet was America's best-selling car brand. Buick and Pontiac thrived as middle-class favorites. Oldsmobile embodied upward mobility. The empire was complete and its power absolute. From Detroit's skyscrapers to the highways stretching across the nation, GM's presence was everywhere. For a time, it seemed impossible that such a giant could ever fall. The shadow behind the shine, yet even in the golden age, shadows were forming. Beneath the glitter of chrome and the roar of V8 engines, problems lurked. The obsession with style over substance created cars that looked spectacular but often lacked reliability. The vast bureaucracy of GM made decision-making slow and innovation sluggish. The company's size, once its greatest strength, was becoming a hidden weakness. And while GM celebrated its dominance, competitors in Europe and Japan were quietly building cars of their own, smaller, more efficient, more reliable. The storm was still far on the horizon, invisible to most. But history has always punished arrogance, and GM's arrogance was growing. The golden age of General Motors was a spectacle of industrial triumph. It was prosperity on wheels, the American dream cast in steel and chrome. But golden ages never last forever. Behind the shine lay cracks, and those cracks would one day split open, bringing the empire crashing down. For now, though, GM stood unchallenged at the summit of power. The giant had never been stronger. The question was not whether it would fall, no one dared ask that, but when. Chapter 4. Cracks in the Empire, the Oil Shocks, and the 1970s. Crisis for decades, General Motors appeared invincible. Its empire stretched across continents. Its cars filled every highway, and its influence reached into the very core of American life. But history has a way of humbling even the most powerful empires. And for GM, the first real tremors of decline began in the 1970s, a decade defined by turbulence, disillusionment, and crisis. The 1970s were not kind to America. The optimism of the post-war years gave way to economic stagnation, political scandal, and cultural upheaval. The Vietnam War fractured national unity. The Watergate scandal shattered trust in government. Inflation soared, unemployment rose, and the once unstoppable American machine began to sputter. And in the middle of this storm stood GM, still enormous, still dominant, but now facing challenges it had never anticipated. For the first time, cracks appeared in the empire. The illusion of stability at the dawn of the 1970s, GM still seemed untouchable. The company continued to control a massive share of the U.S. market. Its cars remained symbols of status and aspiration. Profits were still high, factories still busy, executives still confident. But beneath the surface, warning signs flickered. GM had become bloated, an enormous bureaucracy where decisions took months, sometimes years, to implement. Innovation slowed to a crawl. The obsession with annual style changes had created vehicles that looked modern but were increasingly fragile. Chrome and fins could no longer hide declining quality. Yet the company's leadership dismissed these issues. Arrogance had calcified into corporate culture. GM executives believed they could dictate consumer tastes forever, that Americans would always choose size and style over efficiency and reliability. That assumption would soon prove fatal. The first oil shock. 1973. In October 1973, the world shifted. The Arab members of OPEC, angered by U.S. support for Israel during the Yom Kippur War, declared an oil embargo. The price of oil quadrupled almost overnight. Gasoline shortages swept across America. Lines at gas stations stretched for blocks. Suddenly, the mighty V8 engines that had defined American cars became symbols of waste and excess. For decades, GM had built its empire on size. Big engines, heavy bodies, flashy designs. The oil crisis shattered this foundation. Consumers no longer wanted giant cars that devoured fuel. They wanted efficiency, affordability, and practicality. And in this moment of crisis, GM was caught unprepared. The company had spent years dismissing small cars as un-American, a niche for fringe buyers. Instead, it had doubled down on oversized sedans and trucks. Now, as gas prices soared, consumers fled to Japanese automakers, Toyota, Honda, Nissan, who offered exactly what Americans suddenly needed: small, fuel-efficient, reliable cars. The arrogance of GM's leadership was exposed. They had ignored the storm on the horizon, and when it hit, they had no defenses. The rise of the Japanese threat. The oil crisis opened the door for foreign competition in a way that would permanently reshape the industry. Japanese automakers had long studied the American market, quietly building a reputation for quality and efficiency. Their cars lacked the flash of GM's models, but they delivered something more valuable: reliability and low cost of ownership. Throughout the 1970s, Toyota Corolla, Honda Civic, and Datsun, Nissan, sedans began flooding U.S. roads. They were modest in appearance but consistent in performance. For families struggling with inflation and high fuel prices, these cars offered relief. GM executives initially dismissed the threat. They mocked Japanese cars as cheap tin cans, assuming American patriotism would keep consumers loyal. But loyalty has limits when budgets collapse. One by one, American families abandoned the chrome-heavy Chevrolets and Buicks for leaner, more practical imports. The Japanese didn't just compete, they began winning, and each victory chipped away at GM's dominance. The quality crisis. Even as foreign automakers rose, GM's own quality was collapsing. Throughout the 1970s, the company's obsession with style over substance began to backfire. Cars looked modern, but under the surface they were riddled with flaws. Poorly built engines, fragile transmissions, unreliable electronics. GM's bureaucracy made matters worse. Engineers often found their designs altered or downgraded to cut costs. Executives prioritized quarterly profits over long-term quality. The result was a flood of cars that broke down, rusted quickly, and left customers furious. The gap between perception and reality grew wider each year. GM still had brand power, but the trust of consumers was eroding. Meanwhile, Japanese automakers built reputations for vehicles that lasted 100,000 miles or more with minimal problems. The contrast could not have been sharper. The second oil shock, 1979, AF. The first oil crisis wounded GM. The second nearly crippled it. In 1979, following the Iranian Revolution, global oil supplies were once again disrupted. Gas prices surged, shortages returned, and Americans were forced to confront the same painful reality. Large, inefficient cars were no longer sustainable. Once again, GM was caught off guard. Its product lineup remained bloated, dominated by big sedans and trucks. Attempts to build smaller cars, such as the Chevrolet Vega and the Chevrolet Chevette, ended in disaster. These vehicles were rushed to market, poorly designed and plagued with defects. Instead of competing with the Japanese, they reinforced GM's growing reputation for mediocrity. The second oil shock was not just an economic blow, it was a cultural one. It signaled the end of the American automotive dream of limitless size and power. Consumers now demanded efficiency, and GM could not provide it. The union struggle adding. To GM's troubles was its complicated relationship with the United Auto Workers, UAW. During the Golden Age, GM's immense profits had allowed it to grant generous wages, pensions, and benefits. But as the 1970s dragged on, those obligations became crushing burdens. Each time GM tried to cut costs, the unions resisted. Each time GM raised prices to cover expenses, consumers turned away. The company found itself trapped between rising labor costs and declining consumer demand. What had once been a mutually beneficial partnership between GM and its workers became a bitter struggle that eroded the company's flexibility. This tension would only worsen in the decades to come, but its roots were planted firmly in the crises of the 1970s. Detroit in decline. The struggles of GM mirrored the struggles of Detroit itself. Once a booming metropolis, Detroit began to wither as the auto industry faltered. Factories closed, jobs disappeared, neighborhoods crumbled. The city that had been built by the automobile now suffered from its decline. The 1970s marked the beginning of Detroit's long fall, a decline that would culminate in bankruptcy decades later. And at the center of this collapse was General Motors. The end of illusions. By the close of the 1970s, the illusions of GM's invincibility had shattered. The oil shocks had exposed its vulnerabilities. Japanese automakers had humiliated it with better, more reliable cars. Consumers no longer trusted the company the way they once had. GM was still enormous, still powerful, but the cracks in the empire were undeniable. The golden age was over. What remained was a bloated giant struggling to adapt to a world that had changed forever. The 1970s were not yet the death of General Motors, but they were the end of its innocence. For the first time in its history, GM faced an enemy it could not intimidate, a crisis it could not ignore, and a future it could not control. And yet, despite all the warning signs, the company's leadership refused to accept the reality. They clung to the past, believing the storm would pass. But storms rarely pass. They linger, they grow, and eventually they destroy. The cracks had formed. The collapse was only a matter of time. Chapter 5. The Slow Decay. 1980s and 1990s. Missteps. By the dawn of the 1980s, General Motors was no longer the unshakable titan of the post-war era. The golden age had ended, replaced by doubt, disillusionment, and decline. The oil shocks of the 1970s had battered the company. Foreign competition was rising, and consumers were turning away. Yet, despite these dangers, GM remained vast, wealthy, and, at least on the surface, powerful. This paradox defined the next 2 decades. GM still commanded enormous market share, still employed hundreds of thousands, still produced millions of cars each year. But beneath the surface, the empire was rotting. The decay was not sudden. It was slow, corrosive, almost invisible. Like a great oak tree hollowed out by termites, GM stood tall but weakened. And by the time the 1990s closed, the damage was irreversible. The story of GM in the 1980s and 1990s is a story of arrogance, mismanagement, and wasted opportunity. It is a story of a giant that refused to adapt, even as the world around it changed forever. The 1980s. Struggling for identity. The 1980s should have been a decade of renewal for General Motors. The company had survived the oil shocks and still dominated the American market. With proper vision and bold leadership, GM could have reinvented itself to compete with Japan and Europe. Instead, it stumbled. One of the central problems was identity. GM had too many brands: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, Saturn, GMC, Hummer. Each division competed not just against foreign rivals, but against each other. The market became flooded with vehicles that looked different on the outside, but were nearly identical beneath the surface. This strategy, once effective, now backfired. Consumers began to notice that a Buick and an Oldsmobile often shared the same engines, platforms, and parts, differing only in superficial styling. What had once been a carefully managed hierarchy of brands devolved into redundancy and confusion. Instead of offering choice, GM offered clutter. Meanwhile, Japanese automakers grew stronger. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan expanded production in the United States, building factories in Kentucky, Ohio, and Tennessee. Their cars were no longer just imports, they were made in America, employing American workers and delivering superior quality. GM executives responded not with innovation, but with denial. They spent billions on marketing campaigns, mergers, and half-hearted redesigns, hoping to maintain market share without addressing the root problem. Their cars were simply not as good as the competition. The quality collapse. Quality became GM's greatest weakness in the 1980s. Decades of cutting corners, prioritizing style over engineering, and forcing cars through bloated bureaucracies had eroded consumer trust. The Chevrolet Citation, launched in 1980, was meant to compete with small, efficient imports. Instead, it became infamous for mechanical failures, recalls, and poor performance. The vehicle sold well at first, thanks to GM's reputation, but within a few years, it became a symbol of everything wrong with the company. Similar disasters plagued other models. The Oldsmobile diesel engines of the early 1980s were notorious for unreliability. Cadillac, once the pinnacle of American luxury, tarnished its brand with poorly executed innovations like the V8 6.4 engine, which promised fuel efficiency but delivered constant breakdowns. Consumers noticed. By the mid-1980s, surveys consistently ranked Japanese cars as more reliable, more efficient, and more durable than their American counterparts. GM's reputation for excellence, carefully built over decades, was collapsing. A Saturn. A glimmer of hope? Not everything in the 1980s was failure. In 1985, GM launched Saturn, a bold experiment intended to fight back against Japanese imports. Saturn was marketed as a different kind of car company, with its own culture, factories, and sales methods. Cars were built with polymer panels that resisted rust and dents, and dealerships emphasized customer service over high-pressure sales. At first, Saturn showed promise. Consumers praised the buying experience, and the cars, though modest, earned a reputation for reliability. For a brief moment, it seemed GM had rediscovered its innovative spirit, but Saturn was isolated within GM, treated more as an experiment than a model for the future. Instead of expanding Saturn's success across the corporation, GM executives let it languish. By the late 1990s, Saturn was just another struggling division, eventually abandoned altogether. Saturn's fate symbolized GM's deeper problem. The company knew how to innovate, but lacked the will to change. The 1990s. Global competition intensifies. The 1990s began. GM was still the largest automaker in the world. It sold millions of vehicles annually and remained deeply entrenched in American culture. But beneath the surface, its dominance was slipping away. Japanese automakers expanded rapidly, capturing more market share each year. Toyota's Camry and Honda's Accord became the best-selling sedans in America, cars praised for their reliability, efficiency, and value. Meanwhile, GM's mid-size offerings, Chevrolet Malibu, Pontiac Grand Am, Oldsmobile Cutlass, struggled to compete. European automakers also began to rise. BMW, Mercedes-Benz, and Volkswagen gained prestige among wealthier consumers, while GM's luxury division, Cadillac, fell into decline. Once the standard of the world, Cadillac now lagged behind, producing cars mocked as outdated, underpowered, and poorly designed. GM's response was not reinvention, but desperation. Executives poured billions into acquisitions, partnerships, and overseas ventures. They bought stakes in Saab, Subaru, Isuzu, and even Fiat, none of which delivered lasting success. The company grew larger, but not stronger. The SUV boom, ironically, what saved GM in the 1990s was not innovation, but luck. The decade saw the rise of the SUV boom, fueled by cheap gas and changing consumer tastes. Americans wanted bigger vehicles again: trucks, SUVs, and minivans. GM, with its legacy of producing large cars, was well positioned to take advantage. Chevrolet Suburban, GMC Yukon, and Chevrolet Tahoe became wildly popular. Profits soared, masking deeper structural problems. For a time, it seemed GM had regained its footing, but the SUV boom was a double-edged sword. It made GM complacent once again, reinforcing its addiction to big, fuel-hungry vehicles. Instead of using the profits to modernize, innovate, and improve quality, GM doubled down on SUVs, ignoring the warning signs that this market could collapse just as it had in the 1970s. The bureaucratic monster. By the end of the 1990s, GM had become a bureaucratic monster. Layers of management slowed every decision. Engineers complained that their designs were watered down by cost-cutting executives. Creative talent was stifled. Bold ideas were crushed by endless committees. This culture of stagnation ensured that GM could not respond quickly to changing markets. While Toyota pioneered lean manufacturing and continuous improvement, GM remained stuck in outdated processes. While Honda built cars with unmatched reliability, GM churned out mediocrity. The company was still massive, still profitable on the surface, but inside it was hollow. The decay was undeniable, a legacy in jeopardy. The 1980s and 1990s should have been decades of renewal. GM had the resources, the talent, and the history to adapt and thrive. But instead, it squandered its advantages. It clung to outdated strategies, ignored consumer demands, and allowed arrogance to blind it to reality. By the close of the millennium, GM was still the largest automaker in the world, but its dominance was fragile. Market share had eroded. Brand loyalty had weakened. Competitors had surpassed it in quality, efficiency, and innovation. The empire had not yet fallen, but the rot was spreading. The slow decay of the 1980s and 1990s set the stage for the catastrophe of the 2000s. When the next crisis arrived, GM would not be able to survive. Chapter 6. The Great Unraveling, GM in the 2000s. By the time the new millennium dawned, General Motors was already wounded. The slow decay of the 1980s and 1990s had eroded its strength, hollowed out its brands, and dulled its competitive edge. Yet, to the outside world, GM still looked formidable. It remained the world's largest automaker, producing millions of vehicles annually, employing hundreds of thousands of workers, and boasting iconic brands known across the globe. But empires rarely collapse in a single moment. Their downfall comes through years of denial, missteps, and arrogance. For GM, the 2000s would be the decade when all the cracks widened, when all the mistakes of the past finally converged, and when survival itself came into question. The false comfort of size. At the beginning of the decade, GM executives clung to a dangerous illusion that sheer size guaranteed survival. The company still commanded significant market share in North America, still had a sprawling portfolio of brands, and still generated billions in revenue. To outsiders, GM looked too big to fail. But inside the corporation, size was a curse. The bloated structure made quick decisions impossible. Overlapping brands cannibalized each other. Redundant factories drained resources. Bureaucracy smothered innovation. GM was not a nimble competitor. It was a lumbering giant, stumbling forward while leaner rivals sprinted past. Toyota, Honda, and Nissan were now household names in America, producing cars in U.S. factories with higher quality and lower costs. Toyota, in particular, was emerging as a global powerhouse, pioneering hybrids like the Prius and gaining a reputation for unmatched reliability. GM, meanwhile, was trapped in the past, producing a flood of mediocre sedans and an army of oversized SUVs and trucks. The brand problem. By the early 2000s, GM had far too many brands: Chevrolet, Pontiac, Oldsmobile, Buick, Cadillac, GMC, Saturn, Hummer, Saab, Opel, Vauxhall, and more. Instead of creating diversity, this clutter created confusion. Many of the cars were badge-engineered, essentially the same vehicle sold under different names with minor cosmetic changes. A Chevrolet and a Pontiac often shared the same platform, engine, and features, but were marketed as separate products. Consumers noticed. Brand identities blurred, loyalty evaporated, and GM's once carefully curated hierarchy collapsed into redundancy. The result was financial waste on a massive scale. Billions were spent maintaining dozens of brands that offered little distinction. Instead of focusing resources on building a few world-class cars, GM spread itself thin, trying to keep alive divisions that had long since lost relevance. Oldsmobile, once a prestigious brand, was discontinued in 2004 after years of decline. Pontiac, Saturn, Saab, and Hummer would all eventually follow. Each death was a symbol of GM's inability to adapt, each closure a reminder of wasted potential. The SUV addiction. If one product defined GM in the early 2000s, it was the SUV. Fuel was cheap, the economy was booming, and Americans craved bigger, more powerful vehicles. Chevrolet Suburban, GMC Yukon, Chevrolet Tahoe, Cadillac Escalade, these massive trucks became cultural icons, symbols of status and excess. SUVs and trucks generated enormous profits. For GM, they became a lifeline, masking deeper weaknesses in the company's car lineup. But this success was deceptive. The profits made executives complacent, convincing them that the SUV boom would last forever. Instead of investing in fuel, efficiency, hybrids, or smaller cars, GM doubled down on size. It ignored rising concerns about climate change, ignored the possibility of fuel price spikes, and ignored shifting consumer tastes. Once again, the company was repeating the mistakes of the 1970s, betting everything on vehicles that depended on cheap oil. The quality gap widens. While GM chased profits with oversized trucks, its cars continued to lag behind. Toyota Camry and Honda Accord became America's best-selling sedans, praised for reliability and resale value. GM's offerings, Chevrolet Malibu, Pontiac Grand Prix, Saturn L-Series, were widely seen as inferior. Surveys consistently ranked GM vehicles lower in quality compared to Japanese and even European rivals. Recalls were frequent, reliability poor, and customer satisfaction low. Decades of neglect had destroyed GM's reputation. Consumers no longer trusted the brand. Even Cadillac, once the standard of the world, fell behind. Luxury buyers flocked to BMW, Mercedes-Benz, Lexus, and Acura. Cadillac's attempts to modernize often felt forced, inconsistent, and overshadowed by rivals. The crown jewel of GM's empire had become tarnished. The burden of legacy. Costs beneath the surface, GM faced a financial crisis of staggering proportions. Decades of generous contracts with the United Auto Workers had created crushing obligations for pensions and health care. By the early 2000s, GM was spending billions annually on legacy costs, the benefits owed to retirees and their families. In fact, analysts often joked that GM had become more of a healthcare company than a car company. For every car sold, thousands of dollars went not to innovation or profit, but to cover the weight of past promises. Toyota and Honda, by contrast, operated with leaner labor structures and fewer obligations. They could build cars more cheaply, sell them for less, and still make higher profits. GM was trapped, bleeding cash from a burden it could no longer sustain. The debt spiral as profits from SUVs flowed in. GM executives ignored the looming financial disaster. But when fuel prices began rising in the mid-2000s, SUV sales collapsed. The lifeline snapped. Suddenly, the billions in revenue that had masked GM's structural weaknesses disappeared. To stay afloat, GM turned to debt. It borrowed heavily, refinancing obligations, issuing bonds, and cutting costs where it could. But the debt only grew. Each year, the company sank deeper, unable to escape the spiral. Wall Street began to lose confidence. Credit ratings slipped. Analysts warned that GM was heading toward insolvency. But inside the company, denial reigned. Executives insisted that the problems were temporary, that the SUV market would rebound, that size would protect them. The truth was far darker. The 2008 crisis approaches by 2007. The global economy was teetering. Housing markets were collapsing, financial institutions were over-leveraged, and the credit bubble was about to burst. For GM, already drowning in debt and struggling with declining sales, the coming storm would prove catastrophic. As gas prices soared past $4 a gallon in 2008, demand for SUVs evaporated. Consumers fled to smaller, fuel-efficient cars, the very vehicles GM had neglected for years. Toyota Prius became a symbol of the new era, while GM's lineup looked outdated, bloated, and irrelevant. Sales plummeted, cash reserves vanished, debt mounted. By late 2008, GM was on the brink of collapse. The illusion shattered. The 2000s were not simply a period of decline, they were the great unraveling of General Motors. The illusions of size, the addiction to SUVs, the burden of legacy costs, and the refusal to adapt all converged in a perfect storm. The empire that had once dominated the world was now a giant staggering toward collapse. By the end of the decade, GM would face the greatest crisis in its history, a crisis that would end not just in financial ruin, but in the humiliation of bankruptcy and government rescue. The fall was no longer a possibility. It was inevitable. Chapter 7. The Final Collapse. Bankruptcy in 2009. For nearly a century, General Motors had stood as a monument to American industrial power. It had survived wars, recessions, oil shocks, and foreign competition. But by the end of the first decade of the 21st century, the cracks that had spread for decades finally split the empire apart. The year 2009 would mark the most humiliating moment in GM's history. It was the year the world's largest automaker, once a symbol of strength, wealth, and progress, was forced into bankruptcy, rescued not by its own brilliance, but by the desperate intervention of the United States government. The fall of General Motors was not sudden. It was the culmination of years of arrogance, denial, and missed opportunities. The collapse was both inevitable and shocking, a moment that revealed how far the company had strayed from its once mighty throne. The storm. Before the collapse by late 2008, the global economy was in freefall. The financial crisis that began with the collapse of the U.S. housing market had spiraled into a worldwide disaster. Banks failed, credit dried up, and consumer confidence evaporated. For GM, already weakened by debt, bloated costs, and collapsing sales, the crisis was catastrophic. SUV and truck sales, its primary source of profit, vanished almost overnight as fuel prices soared and consumers tightened their budgets. Dealerships stood empty, factories slowed to a halt, and inventories piled up. Each month brought staggering losses. GM was burning through billions in cash, unable to cover its obligations, unable to sustain itself. The company that once bragged about its size now faced the abyss. The plea for help. By the end of 2008, it was clear. GM could not survive alone. The company turned to Washington, begging for a bailout. Executives warned that without immediate aid, the collapse of GM would devastate the U.S. economy. The stakes were enormous. GM employed over 200,000 people directly, but its supply chain supported millions more: parts manufacturers, dealerships, trucking companies, local businesses. If GM fell, it threatened to take down the entire American auto industry with it. In November 2008, GM's CEO, Rick Wagoner, along with executives from Chrysler and Ford, appeared before Congress, pleading for emergency loans. The hearings were brutal. Lawmakers grilled the executives, accusing them of arrogance and incompetence. The image of Wagoner arriving in Washington aboard a private jet became a symbol of everything wrong with Detroit's leadership: lavish, entitled, and disconnected from reality. Public opinion was divided. Many Americans believed GM had brought disaster upon itself through decades of mismanagement. Why should taxpayers bail out a company that had ignored reality for so long? Others argued that GM was simply too big to fail, that its collapse would trigger an economic catastrophe in the middle of the worst financial crisis since the Great Depression. In the end, Washington chose survival over principle. GM would be saved, but not without pain. The descent into bankruptcy. Despite emergency loans, GM's cash reserves evaporated. By mid-2009, there was no choice left. On June 1, 2009, General Motors filed for Chapter 11 bankruptcy protection, the fourth largest bankruptcy in U.S. history. The filing was both shocking and symbolic. The company that once defined American industry was now bankrupt, unable to sustain itself without government intervention. Factories closed, dealerships were shuttered, and thousands of workers lost their jobs. The empire had crumbled. But unlike past collapses, this was not a final death. It was a controlled demolition, designed to save what could still be saved. The U.S. government, along with the Canadian government, stepped in with tens of billions of dollars in aid. GM would be restructured, rebuilt, and reborn, but only after shedding the weight that had dragged it down for decades. The sacrifice's bankruptcy meant sacrifice. Entire divisions were eliminated. Pontiac, once a proud brand with a legacy of performance, cars, was killed. Saturn, once a symbol of innovation, was abandoned. Saab, the quirky Swedish automaker GM had acquired, was left to wither. Hummer, A brand born from military vehicles in excess was sold off. Only the strongest brands survived: Chevrolet, Cadillac, Buick, and GMC. The rest were consigned to history, victims of GM's refusal to adapt. Thousands of dealerships were closed. Workers were laid off. Factories went dark. For communities built around GM plants, the bankruptcy was devastating, leaving behind empty buildings and shattered economies. Shareholders were wiped out. Creditors took heavy losses, and longtime executives were forced out, most notably Rick Wagoner, who was pushed to resign under pressure from the Obama administration. The message was clear: GM would survive, but only if it abandoned its past. Government Motors. In the aftermath of the bankruptcy, the U.S. government became GM's largest shareholder, injecting tens of billions to keep the company alive. For a time, critics derisively called the company Government Motors. The bailout was controversial. Supporters argued it saved millions of jobs and preserved the backbone of American manufacturing. Opponents claimed it rewarded failure, propping up a company that deserved to die. Yet, despite the anger, the intervention worked. GM shed its crushing debt, restructured its operations, and emerged from bankruptcy leaner and more focused. Within a year, it returned to profitability. By 2010, GM held an initial public offering, selling shares and reducing government ownership. But the scars remained. The bankruptcy forever tarnished GM's reputation, turning the once proud symbol of American dominance into a cautionary tale. The human cost. The bankruptcy was not just a financial story. It was a human tragedy. Entire communities across the Midwest and Rust Belt were devastated. Towns that had depended on GM for generations saw factories close, jobs vanish, and hope disappear. For workers, the betrayal was personal. Many had devoted their entire lives to GM, believing in the promise of stability and loyalty. Now they found themselves discarded, victims of a system that had failed them. The anger was palpable. To many, GM's bankruptcy was not just about cars. It was about the collapse of the American dream itself, the fall of an empire. The bankruptcy of 2009 marked the end of an era. General Motors, once the world's largest and most powerful automaker, had been humbled, stripped of its glory, and forced to rely on the very government it once dwarfed in influence. It was more than a financial failure. It was the collapse of an empire. For decades, GM had symbolized American power, wealth, and progress. Now it symbolized arrogance, decline, and missed opportunity. The company survived, but the myth was dead. A warning to the future GM's bankruptcy sent shockwaves across the world. It was a warning, not just to automakers but to all corporations. No empire is invincible. Size, history, and legacy mean nothing if arrogance blinds leadership to reality. The fall of General Motors proved that even the mightiest can collapse, that the illusion of permanence is just that, an illusion. By 2009, the dream was over. The empire had fallen. Chapter 8. Lessons from the Fall. What GM's collapse means for America and the world. The bankruptcy of General Motors in 2009 was more than the story of a company's downfall. It was a mirror held up to an entire nation, reflecting not only the failures of corporate leadership, but the fragility of the American dream itself. For nearly a century, GM was America. Its rise symbolized the triumph of capitalism, industrial strength, and innovation. Its decline revealed the dangers of arrogance, denial, and complacency. To understand GM's fall is to understand the lessons it offers, not just for automakers, but for every company, every government, and every society that believes itself. Autoimmune to collapse. Lesson 1. No empire is too big to fail. For decades, GM was treated as untouchable. It dominated markets, influenced governments, and shaped culture. Its leaders believed sheer size was protection against failure. After all, how could a company that employed hundreds of thousands and generated billions in revenue possibly collapse? But history does not respect size. Rome fell, the British Empire receded, and GM, once the largest corporation on earth, was brought to its knees by its own inertia. The first lesson of GM's collapse is simple. No empire, corporate or national, is invincible. Size can mask weakness, but it cannot prevent decay. In fact, it often accelerates it. The bigger the empire, the slower it moves. The slower it moves, the easier it is for rivals to overtake it. Lesson 2. Innovation cannot be ignored. In the 20th century, GM defined innovation. It pioneered annual model changes, introduced powerful engines, and created vehicles that became cultural icons. But by the late 20th century, GM had stopped innovating. It became complacent, focused on short-term profits instead of long-term survival. Meanwhile, Toyota, Honda, and others invested in quality, efficiency, and new technologies. Toyota's Prius became the future of the automobile while GM clung to oversized SUVs. The lesson is clear. Innovation is not optional. Companies that fail to adapt will be left behind. Markets change. Technology evolves. Consumers demand more. To ignore this is to guarantee collapse. Lesson 3. The danger of arrogance. GM's leadership believed it knew better than consumers, better than rivals, better than reality itself. When quality issues piled up, executives dismissed them. When Japanese competitors gained ground, they downplayed the threat. When oil crises struck, they assumed cheap fuel would return. This arrogance blinded GM to the world around it. Instead of adapting, it doubled down on the very mistakes that doomed it. The third lesson is harsh but undeniable. Arrogance is fatal. Success can breed overconfidence, and overconfidence can destroy empires. Leaders who refuse to listen, who ignore warning signs, and who believe they are untouchable, invite disaster. Lesson 4. The burden of the past. By the 2000s, GM was drowning under the weight of promises made decades earlier, pensions, healthcare, and benefits that consumed billions in costs. These legacy costs became chains, binding the company to its past and preventing investment in its future. Every great power faces this problem. Nations burdened by debt, companies weighed down by outdated structures, individuals trapped by past mistakes. All risk collapse if they cannot shed the weight. The lesson is sobering. The past can destroy the future. Survival requires difficult choices, choices GM avoided until it was too late. Lesson 5. The fragility of the American dream. Perhaps the most painful lesson of GM's collapse was what it revealed about the fragility of the American dream. For decades, GM jobs were a ticket to the middle class. A worker could support a family, buy a house, send children to college, and retire with dignity. When GM fell, that promise collapsed too. Entire communities were gutted. Workers who had believed in stability found themselves abandoned. Towns that had thrived for generations became ghostly reminders of lost prosperity. GM's fall was not just a corporate tragedy. It was a social one. It showed that the American dream was a final warning. General Motors' collapse is not an isolated story. It is a warning to every company, every leader, every nation that believes itself untouchable. The same forces that destroyed GM, arrogance, denial, complacency, exist everywhere. History repeats itself. Empires rise and empires fall. The only question is whether the lessons of the past will be heeded or ignored. The fall of General Motors was not just the fall of a company. It was the fall of an idea. that greatness, once achieved, can never be lost. The truth is far darker. Greatness is fragile. Power is temporary. And the higher the empire, the harder the fall. Thanks for watching. If you found this story interesting, don't forget to hit the like button. It really helps the channel grow. And if you love uncovering the biggest business collapses in history, make sure to subscribe so you don't miss the next story. See you in the next video.